A boy vanishes for 7 years, taking his newborn brother with him. Then one day, he returns with a truth that changes everything. What happens next will leave you speechless. You must join our channel and hit subscribe, because only those who are ready to uncover the secrets of a 7-year-long disappearance will do it before this story begins. The wind howled outside, carrying with it the chill of an autumn evening that pressed in against the walls of the Thompson household. Inside, the air was thick with the sharp scent of freshly brewed coffee, the warmth from the fireplace offering little comfort against the unease that sat heavy in the room. Thomas Thompson paced in front of the window, his fists clenched tight at his sides, his face tight with anger. Caroline, his wife, sat at the kitchen table, her fingers trembling slightly as she pushed the edge of her cup back and forth. Their eyes barely met, both lost in thoughts they didn't wish to voice aloud. Ethan stood just inside the doorway, watching his father with a confused, pained expression. He had seen his father angry before, but never like this, never so consumed. His heart hammered in his chest, and he could feel his pulse pounding in his ears. His father's words earlier had cut deep, far deeper than he was willing to admit. "You never listen, Ethan," Thomas had shouted. "You think you know what's best, but you don't. You're nothing but a child." Ethan's hand gripped Noah's tiny body closer to his chest, the warmth of his baby brother offering the only sense of peace he had. The infant cooed softly, his tiny hand curling around Ethan's thumb, completely unaware of the storm brewing around them. Ethan shifted his weight, his mind racing. He couldn't quite understand why his father was so upset. It had been a simple conversation, one he had tried to listen to. But the more he tried to understand, the less it made sense. His father had always been a man of few words, but something had changed. There was a dark edge to his tone tonight, something that Ethan couldn't quite place. It wasn't just the money, the talk of bills, the accusations that had felt like cold stones thrown his way. It was something else, something more dangerous. Ethan's heart ached for his father, the man who had once been his hero, the one who had shown him how to be strong. But tonight, Ethan wasn't sure what was real anymore. Noah shifted in his arms, letting out a soft cry that sliced through the tension in the room. Ethan's gaze softened as he looked down at his brother, his heart heavy with the weight of the promise he had made to himself long ago, to protect him at all costs. He was just a child, but Noah was his responsibility now. He had to keep him safe. It wasn't just about running away from his father's anger or the shadows of his family's debts anymore. It was about keeping Noah out of whatever danger had begun to creep into their lives. He glanced back at his father. Thomas was still pacing, muttering under his breath, the lines of his face drawn tight in frustration. "I can't keep doing this," he muttered. "You'll never understand, Ethan. You just won't." Ethan's chest tightened, but there was a flicker of something deep in his gut, something that whispered to him that he couldn't stay here. His father was lost to something dark, and no matter how hard he tried, Ethan knew there was no saving him. But Noah was still innocent. He was still safe. He gently shifted the baby in his arms, the soft weight of his brother comforting him in the chaos. He glanced one last time at his parents, the dim light from the fireplace casting long shadows across the room. Without another word, Ethan turned, his steps hesitant but sure. He moved toward the door, the cold air rushing in as he opened it. His father's voice rang out from behind him, low but firm. "Where are you going, Ethan?" Ethan paused, his hand on the doorframe, but he didn't turn around. His eyes lingered on the night outside, the darkness, the unknown. His heart beat faster as he made his decision. "I'm leaving," he whispered to himself. His voice barely made a sound, lost in the wind, but it felt like a promise. A vow to protect the only family he had left. The door slammed shut behind him, the sound echoing through the empty house, and Ethan stepped into the night. As the days turned into weeks, the town of Harrowsville began to whisper, then grow quiet. There were no clues, no signs of where Ethan had gone or why. The search was called off after a month, and people slowly moved on, returning to their lives, their routines. But for Jonah, Ethan's younger brother, there was no moving on. The silence that had descended over their family only deepened the ache in his chest, a constant reminder that his brother was out there somewhere, and he couldn't stop looking for him. "I'll find him. I'll bring him back," Jonah often said, his voice steady despite the years of growing silence. Jonah stood at the edge of the overgrown field, staring at the farmhouse through a curtain of rustling leaves. The structure loomed like a specter, abandoned and forgotten, its wooden planks sagging beneath years of neglect. The setting sun cast long shadows across the land, and the light gave the house an almost ethereal glow, as though the past was still clinging to it, refusing to fade away. He had come here for one reason: he had to know what happened to Ethan. His brother had vanished here, and Jonah had spent years living in the aftermath, haunted by questions that had no answers. The map he had found, the coordinates, all led him here, to this forsaken place. He swallowed hard, his throat dry with anxiety. His heart pounded as the memory of his father's warning echoed in his mind. "Don't go, Jonah," his father, Thomas, had begged, his voice trembling with fear. "There's nothing there for you. Nothing that'll bring Ethan back." Jonah could still hear the desperation in his father's voice, the kind that comes from a man who had seen too much, who had been scarred by something so deeply buried that even speaking of it was too painful. But Jonah couldn't turn away anymore. He had to know. He clenched his fists, the map crumpling slightly in his grip as his breath caught. Every instinct screamed at him to turn back. But every step forward was a step closer to the truth, and that truth had always been just out of reach. Jonah wasn't going to let fear control him any longer. The wind shifted, carrying with it the musty scent of rotting wood and damp earth. The farmhouse seemed to mock him, standing silent and cold, like a witness to some unspeakable crime. Jonah's eyes traced the lines of the building. Its windows were dark, the door hanging ajar like an invitation to enter. He took a slow, steadying breath, the air thick with the scent of old rain and decaying leaves. He could hear the rustle of the wind, the creak of the farmhouse, and his own pulse thumping in his ears. Every step he took felt heavier than the last, as if the weight of the years of the unanswered questions was bearing down on him. When Jonah reached the front door, he hesitated. His hand hovered over the rusty doorknob, the metal cold and slick beneath his fingertips. His pulse quickened, but he couldn't turn back now. With a firm twist, the door groaned open, revealing a dark, narrow hallway inside. Dust motes danced in the dim light that filtered through cracks in the boards. He stepped inside, the floorboards creaking under his weight. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and age, and the silence was oppressive, pressing in on him from all sides. Jonah's flashlight beam cut through the darkness, casting long, wavering shadows that seemed to stretch across the walls. His breath was shallow as he moved forward, his footsteps soft but deliberate. He could almost hear Ethan's voice in the air, could almost feel the faint brush of his brother's presence. The house was a graveyard of memories, each room holding secrets Jonah couldn't quite grasp. He wanted to believe that somewhere in these walls, he would find the key to his brother's disappearance, the missing piece of a puzzle that had eluded him for so long. He made his way through the house, the flashlight revealing fragments of the past. Broken furniture, faded wallpaper, and photographs that had long since yellowed. The house seemed to sigh as Jonah moved, as if the very structure was weary of holding its secrets. He passed rooms that looked like they had been abandoned in the middle of daily life, dishes left on the counter, a chair knocked over in the corner. It was as though someone had just walked away and never returned. His heart clenched at the thought. Had Ethan been here? Had he lived here before he vanished? Was there something more to his disappearance than anyone had ever suspected? Jonah reached the stairs, his footsteps slow and measured. The wooden banister was cold to the touch, the creaks of the steps louder now in the silence. As he ascended, the air seemed to grow thicker, the tension in his chest tightening with each step. The second floor was no better. Rooms in disarray, sheets stained with time and neglect. But as Jonah reached the end of the hallway, something caught his eye. A door, tucked behind a stack of forgotten crates and old furniture, stood ajar. It was different from the other rooms, more secluded, hidden from view. Jonah's heart skipped. This was it, the place his brother had been drawn to, the place that had held secrets for all these years. He approached cautiously, the beam of his flashlight flicking across the worn wood of the doorframe. The room beyond was cloaked in darkness, but Jonah could feel it. There was something here, something important. Taking a deep breath, he pushed the door open. It creaked loudly, the sound echoing through the stillness of the house. Inside was a room, small and musty, lined with shelves that held books, faded photographs, and stacks of old files. Jonah's pulse quickened as he stepped inside, his flashlight sweeping across the cluttered space. His eyes fell on the first photograph he saw, his father, Thomas, standing next to a man Jonah didn't recognize. The man had a cold look in his eyes, an unsettling intensity that seemed to pierce through the photograph itself. Jonah felt his stomach churn as he stared at the man, trying to place the familiarity. But the deeper he stared, the more a sense of dread crept over him. He moved forward, his breath hitching as he scanned the papers scattered across the room. Some were filled with cryptic notes in Ethan's handwriting, maps, locations, and strange symbols. Others were letters, most addressed to someone Jonah didn't know. But one letter stood out, a note that made his blood run cold. It was addressed to his father. The words were unmistakable. "The deal will be done. No turning back." Jonah's heart stopped as he read the words again, the weight of their meaning sinking in. His hands trembled as he sifted through the papers, his mind racing. And then he found it, the thing that shattered everything he thought he knew about his family. A letter with the words, "The Syndicate," written boldly across the top. His stomach dropped as he read the chilling words beneath. "The boy knows too much. We must silence him." Jonah's head spun as he pieced together the truth. Ethan had known. Ethan had been trying to stop something much bigger than he had ever realized. And whatever had happened to him, it wasn't an accident. It had been planned. "I'm not alone in this," Jonah whispered, the weight of the revelation crashing down on him. His brother had been running from something far more dangerous than anyone had ever imagined. And now Jonah had inherited that fight. "Ethan, where are you?" he whispered, his heart racing with fear. Jonah's footsteps echoed through the silent, decaying farmhouse. The air was thick with dust, and the faint smell of mildew clung to the walls. His flashlight beam flickered, barely cutting through the darkness, casting long, twisted shadows on the crumbling wood. The house felt alive in a way that unnerved him, as if it were holding its breath, waiting for him to uncover whatever it had been hiding. Every room he entered seemed to be trapped in time, untouched by the outside world, as though it were waiting for someone like Jonah to stumble upon its secrets. As he moved down the narrow hallway, his heart beat faster, the weight of his search pressing on him. He was close. He could feel it. The map from Ethan's room, the cryptic notes, the warnings from his father, all of it had led him here. The farmhouse was the key, the place where Ethan had last been seen. But the deeper Jonah went into the house, the more it felt like something was watching him, something that didn't want him to find the truth. Jonah paused at the door to the basement. The floor creaked under his feet, and for a moment he hesitated. He wasn't sure what he expected to find, but he knew it was something that would change everything, something he wasn't prepared to face. But he had come this far. He had to know. Swallowing his fear, he descended the creaky steps, each one groaning under his weight. The basement smelled of damp wood and cold stone, the musty scent of years of neglect. His flashlight beam swept over the space, revealing piles of old crates, broken furniture, and the remnants of forgotten lives. It was then that he saw it, a rusted door, nearly hidden behind a stack of weathered crates. Jonah's breath caught in his throat. The door was out of place, almost too obvious in its quiet defiance of the surrounding decay. He approached slowly, each step deliberate, as if the house itself might protest. His fingers brushed the cold metal handle, and with a quick yank, the door creaked open. A cloud of dust swirled in the air, and Jonah's heart skipped a beat as the scent of something ancient and forgotten flooded his senses. Inside the hidden room, The air was thick with a kind of oppressive silence. Shelves lined the walls, each one crammed with old books, yellowing papers, and photographs that seemed out of place. Jonah's eyes darted from one item to the next, each discovery more puzzling than the last. His fingers trembled as he sifted through the papers, the scribbled handwriting barely legible in the dim light. And then his hand froze. He found the photograph. It was a black-and-white image of his father, Thomas, standing beside a man Jonah had never seen before. The man's eyes were cold, calculating, and something about his gaze sent a chill racing down Jonah's spine. The photo itself seemed out of place, almost too perfect, like it had been carefully staged. Jonah's breath hitched as he turned the photo over, revealing a message scrawled in ink. "The deal will be done. No turning back." Jonah's hands shook as he held the photograph, his mind racing. What was this? What did it mean? His father had always been distant, but Jonah had never imagined anything like this. Why was his father involved with this man? The weight of the photo, of the words written on the back, made the room feel even smaller, the walls closing in around him. He wasn't alone in this. His father, the man he thought he knew, had secrets, dark ones. Jonah's mind spun as he continued to search the room, the papers now blurring together in his haste. He found more letters, each one more chilling than the last. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the words were unmistakable. "The boy knows too much. We must silence him." Jonah's blood ran cold. Ethan had known. Ethan had uncovered something dangerous, something that had forced him to flee, to protect his family, to protect Jonah. Ethan had been running from these people, from this syndicate. Jonah's pulse quickened, his thoughts a blur. The syndicate wasn't just a vague shadow in the town. It was real, it was powerful, and it had taken Ethan. Jonah's breath caught in his throat as the realization sank in. He had come here to find his brother, but he had found something much worse, his father's complicity, the depths of a conspiracy that had stretched its roots into every part of their lives. Ethan had been right. The world Jonah had known was a lie. Jonah stepped back, his heart pounding in his chest. The room, once filled with the promise of answers, now felt like a tomb. He was in deeper than he could have ever imagined. "I'm not alone in this," Jonah whispered, his voice hoarse, his eyes scanning the room for anything else that might offer another clue. His mind raced, piecing together the fragments of his brother's desperate search for the truth. Jonah's resolve hardened, the fear that had gripped him earlier now replaced with something stronger, a need to find Ethan. No matter what it took, Jonah sat across from his father at the small, worn kitchen table, the shadows of the evening creeping through the half-closed blinds. The once familiar warmth of the home seemed to have slipped away, replaced by a coldness that tightened Jonah's chest. The air was thick with unspoken words, the tension between them almost palpable. Thomas had always been a man of few words, but tonight, his silence felt heavier than ever. His eyes, usually sharp and distant, now seemed clouded, lost in thoughts Jonah couldn't understand. Jonah's hands fidgeted with the edge of his shirt, his mind racing. He had uncovered enough. He had seen the truth in the old photographs, read the chilling letters that connected his father to the dark, shadowy syndicate. For years, Jonah had searched for his brother. But now, the pieces were falling into place, and the truth was far more complicated than he had ever imagined. Ethan hadn't just disappeared, he had been silenced. Jonah's heart pounded as he fought to steady his breath, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He had to do this. He had to confront the man who had raised him, the man who had always been his hero, the man who had kept so many secrets. But even as he steeled himself for the confrontation, a small voice in the back of his mind whispered that nothing would ever be the same after tonight. His father's eyes met his for the first time in what felt like hours. Jonah swallowed hard, his throat dry, and forced himself to speak, his voice trembling. "Dad, I know about the syndicate. I know you've been involved with them." For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Thomas's face drained of color, and his eyes widened, filled with shock and something deeper, a fear Jonah had never seen in him before. He froze, unable to speak, his jaw tightening as if the words he needed to say were caught somewhere deep inside. Jonah's stomach churned, but he pressed on, feeling the walls of his own heart closing in on him. He had to know the truth, no matter how it broke him. "I never wanted you to know, Jonah." Thomas's voice finally cracked, barely above a whisper. He reached for his glass, his hand shaking, before he put it back down, as if the weight of the confession was too much to bear. His eyes darted away, focusing on something distant. "I never wanted any of you to know." Jonah leaned forward, his pulse racing. He could feel the anger boiling in his chest, but it was overpowered by something darker, something colder. "You let them take Ethan, didn't you?" Jonah's voice broke, the raw emotion in it tearing through him. "You let him walk straight into the hands of people who wanted him gone. Why didn't you stop them, Dad?" Thomas flinched at the words, his face contorting in pain, as though the guilt was physically pulling him under. He shook his head slowly, a tear slipping down his cheek, though he quickly wiped it away. "I tried, Jonah. Believe me, I tried. But once you're in their grasp, once you make a deal with the devil, there's no way out. They don't let you go. I didn't have a choice." Jonah's mind spun, the room feeling smaller and smaller around him as his father's words sank in. He had always believed in his father, had trusted him with everything. But now everything was unraveling. How much of his life had been a lie? How long had his father been hiding this darkness? "What do you mean?" Jonah's voice dropped to a whisper, the question hanging in the air like a heavy fog. "What do you mean by they? What happened to Ethan? Where is he?" Thomas's eyes flickered with fear, but he didn't answer right away. He opened his mouth as though he wanted to speak, but then closed it, as though the words had been stolen from him. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The only sound in the room was the ticking of the old clock on the wall, each tick feeling like a drumbeat in Jonah's chest. Finally, Thomas looked up, his face stricken with guilt. Ethan was trying to bring it all down. He found out everything, Jonah. Everything about the syndicate, about what they were doing in this town. He wanted to expose them. He wanted to destroy it all. And they knew it. They knew he was a threat. His voice cracked, the weight of the confession breaking him apart. "They took him." Jonah's heart stopped. His breath hitched, and for a moment, the world seemed to blur around him. The pieces that had never made sense, the nights when his father was distant, the lies, the sudden wealth that had always seemed out of place, came crashing together like a tidal wave. Ethan hadn't just run away. Ethan had been taken. Jonah's hands trembled as his mind tried to process the enormity of what he was hearing. "No," Jonah whispered, shaking his head. "No, this can't be true. You—" He stopped, his voice catching. He couldn't even finish the sentence. "I don't know where he is anymore, Jonah," Thomas whispered, his voice filled with an unbearable sorrow. He closed his eyes briefly, as though blocking out the pain that had haunted him for years. "But I know they're still watching. They won't stop until they finish what they started." Jonah stood frozen in the hallway, the weight of his father's confession pressing down on him like a physical force. Ethan hadn't just disappeared. He had been hunted. The words echoed in his mind, reverberating through every inch of his body. His father had admitted it with such quiet, resigned finality, as if he'd known the truth all along but had never dared to speak it. The syndicate. Jonah didn't fully understand it, but he understood enough. They took him. The chilling realization swept over him like a cold gust of wind, one that numbed his bones and made his heart pound in his chest. He stepped out of the house into the darkened night, feeling as though the walls of the small, quiet town were closing in on him. Harrowsville, a place that had once felt safe, now felt suffocating. He looked around, as if expecting someone, something to be watching him from the shadows. His breath quickened, but he forced himself to calm down. He couldn't afford to let fear control him. Ethan wouldn't have given up. Neither will I. The thought steadied his nerves, grounding him with a clarity he hadn't had before. Ethan's fight had been for their family, for the truth, and Jonah would finish what his brother started. He had to. Jonah moved swiftly through the house, his steps light, his mind racing. He had to act fast. There was no time to waste. He couldn't do this alone. Not anymore. He needed Caleb, the only person who had ever believed in his search for Ethan, who had stood by him when the rest of the town turned their backs. The kitchen felt colder than usual when Jonah walked in. His father's words still hung in the air, thick and suffocating. But Jonah's gaze fell on the drawer, the one his father always kept locked. It was barely noticeable, an old, nondescript drawer buried beneath the clutter of forgotten papers and receipts. Jonah's pulse quickened as he approached it. This was it. He didn't know what he was looking for, but he knew something was hidden there, something Ethan left behind. His hands trembled slightly as he yanked open the drawer. There, tucked underneath a stack of old bills, was a manila folder. Jonah's heart skipped. The papers inside were yellowed with age, the edges frayed, as though they had been handled too many times. As he flipped through them, his mind raced with a mix of hope and dread. Ethan's handwriting filled the pages, the letters scrawled in a frantic, urgent hand. They were full of cryptic messages, locations, names, dates, things that Jonah didn't entirely understand. But one paper caught his eye. It was a map. Not just any map, but one that showed a location outside of town. A warehouse. Jonah felt his stomach twist in knots. The words at the top of the map read, "The syndicate meets here. Soon." His breath caught in his throat. He stared at the map, feeling the weight of it all settle over him. This wasn't just a clue. It was a call to action. He wasn't just chasing his brother anymore. He was chasing the truth that could destroy the syndicate, the truth that could destroy everything. Jonah ran his fingers over the paper, his mind racing. They were meeting there. The syndicate. Soon. He had to get there. He had to see this through, but he knew he couldn't do it alone. He couldn't face the syndicate not without help. Not without Caleb. The urgency in Jonah's chest flared. Caleb. He needed Caleb more than ever. Jonah didn't hesitate. He grabbed his phone and dialed, his fingers shaking as he pressed the number into the screen. It rang twice before Caleb picked up. "Jonah?" Caleb's voice was sleepy but steady, the sound of his friend's name grounding Jonah's rising panic. "Caleb, I need your help. It's about Ethan." "It's about everything," Jonah said, his voice tight with desperation. He could hear Caleb shift on the other end, the sound of sheets rustling. "I'm listening," Caleb replied, his voice alert now, the sleep gone. Jonah could hear the concern in Caleb's voice, the same concern that had kept him by Jonah's side all these years. Jonah let out a shaky breath. "I found something. A warehouse. The syndicate is meeting there. They're planning something. I need you." A long pause. Caleb didn't respond immediately, and Jonah felt his heart sink. But then, Caleb's voice broke through the silence, firm and resolute. "I'm in. Let's do this." Jonah felt a wave of relief wash over him. Caleb's unwavering support had always been a constant in his life, and now, more than ever, Jonah needed him. The two of them had been through so much together, and now they would face this darkness head-on. Jonah's mind clicked into place. There was no turning back now. No more waiting. No more hiding. The truth was waiting for them, and they were going to uncover it, no matter the cost. They would go to that warehouse, and they would expose the syndicate for what it was. Jonah's voice was steady, filled with the resolve that had only grown since he'd learned the truth. "We're going to get him back," he said, his words quiet but filled with fierce determination. Jonah and Caleb crouched low, their bodies tense as they crept along the side of the warehouse. The wind was biting, cutting through their jackets and sending a shiver down Jonah's spine. Every step seemed amplified, echoing in the silent night as they moved cautiously, careful not to make a sound. The warehouse loomed in front of them like some forgotten relic, large, grim, and isolated on the edge of town. High rusted fences surrounded it, casting long shadows under the dim moonlight. There was something unsettling about the place, something that made Jonah's stomach twist in knots. The walls seemed to close in on him with every step, a suffocating reminder of how deep he was wading into this dangerous world. A world where the truth about his brother's disappearance was tangled in lies and corruption. "Do you hear that?" Caleb whispered, his voice barely audible. Jonah froze. There, just on the edge of hearing, was the faint murmur of voices drifting on the cold breeze. His heart skipped a beat. They were not alone. His breath caught in his throat as fear and anticipation collided inside him. Caleb's hand gripped his arm, the tension palpable. Jonah's mind raced, his every instinct screaming at him to turn back, to leave this place behind. But he couldn't. Ethan had been here, and if there was a chance, just a chance, that the answers Jonah sought were within reach, he couldn't back down now. He couldn't let his brother's sacrifice be in vain. "Let's keep moving," Jonah muttered, his voice tight with determination. They circled the building, their eyes scanning every crevice, every shadow. The cold air stung their faces, but Jonah hardly noticed. He was consumed with the need to find the entrance, to uncover whatever lay hidden within these walls. His pulse quickened, his thoughts narrowing to the mission ahead. There had to be something here, something that would finally piece together the mystery that had haunted him for so long. Caleb spotted it first, a small, rusted door wedged behind a stack of crates. Jonah nodded silently, and they moved toward it, the weight of their bodies pressing softly against the cracked concrete floor. They reached the door, the metallic smell of the warehouse filling their nostrils. Caleb tested the handle, and to their relief, it turned with a soft creak. The door swung open, revealing the darkness inside. Jonah's flashlight cut through the blackness as they stepped in, their footsteps muffled by the dust-covered floor. The air was thick with mildew, the smell of decay hanging in the damp space. The walls were covered with peeling paint, the only sound their steady breathing and the faint hum of distant machinery. Jonah's heart thudded in his chest, each beat loud in his ears. This was it, the place where it all began. This was the last stretch of the trail that could lead him to Ethan. He wasn't sure what he'd find, but he knew one thing. He couldn't turn back. They moved deeper into the warehouse, their eyes darting to every corner. The flicker of Jonah's flashlight revealed shadows that seemed to move with them, as if the warehouse itself were alive, watching. The deeper they went, the more the air felt thick and oppressive, like the weight of the building was closing in on them. Jonah's hands were clammy, his mind racing with possibilities, each more dangerous than the last. And then, just as his thoughts were starting to spiral, they reached the first of many narrow hallways. The walls were lined with shelves, stacked high with boxes and crates. Jonah's breath caught in his throat as he thought he saw movement ahead. He held his breath, straining his ears. Was it just his imagination, or were there others here? A flicker of movement confirmed his fear. Jonah's heart skipped a beat as he saw the figure ahead, several men, standing around a table, their low voices just barely audible. They were too far away for Jonah to make out their words, but he could tell they were deep in conversation. The tension in his chest grew with every passing second. He recognized one of the men almost immediately, Dorian Kane, the politician, the man at the center of everything, Ethan's disappearance, the syndicate, and now this warehouse. Jonah's stomach churned with disgust as he watched Kane speak to a man Jonah had never seen before. His gut twisted at the way they exchanged looks, the silent communication between them, and the strange sense of camaraderie that hung between them. Jonah instinctively took a step back, his heart racing, but Caleb held him in place, a firm grip on his arm. "We need to get out of here," Caleb whispered, his voice strained with urgency. "Now." Jonah's instincts screamed at him to flee, but something held him back. He had to know what they were talking about. He had to understand what was going on here. This wasn't just about his brother anymore. This was bigger than he had ever imagined. The syndicate's reach, the influence it had over the town, it wasn't confined to just Harrowsville. This was something that stretched far beyond the small town, something that involved forces Jonah could barely comprehend. The floor creaked under Jonah's foot. The sound was slight, but it was enough. The men around the table froze, their heads snapping toward him. The air seemed to freeze, as if time itself had stopped. Jonah's blood ran cold. Dorian Kane's eyes locked onto him, and Jonah knew in that instant that they had been spotted. "Who's there?" Cain's voice rang out, sharp and menacing, like the strike of a whip. His tone sent a chill straight to Jonah's bones. There was no mistaking the danger in his voice. No mistaking that they had been made. Panic surged through Jonah, but he didn't hesitate. He turned to Caleb, their eyes locking for one brief moment before they bolted for the nearest exit. "We've been made," Jonah yelled, his voice high with the sudden adrenaline that surged through his veins. His legs were already moving before his mind could catch up, carrying him down the narrow hallway, the sounds of footsteps echoing behind them. Jonah and Caleb burst out of the warehouse door, their hearts pounding as they sprinted into the dark alley. The sound of heavy boots echoed behind them, growing louder with each passing second. Jonah's breath came in short, ragged bursts, the chill night air biting at his lungs. He dared a quick glance over his shoulder, but the shadows were closing in. The Enforcers' syndicate men were hot on their heels. His thoughts were a whirlwind. The pieces of the puzzle were finally starting to fit together, but there was no time to analyze it all. Every street they turned onto felt like another trap, another move closer to being caught. Jonah's mind flickered back to the warehouse, the heated discussion they had overheard, Dorian Cain's smug face, the realization that this wasn't just about Ethan anymore. It was about something much bigger. The syndicate wasn't some small-time operation. It was a network of power, control, and corruption that stretched its fingers into every crevice of their lives. Caleb, silent but steady beside him, kept pace easily. His face was set in grim determination, his eyes scanning the alleyways for any sign of danger. Jonah had always admired how Caleb remained calm under pressure, the way his mind worked even when the situation seemed impossible. But tonight, even Caleb couldn't disguise the tension in his posture, the rigid set of his shoulders. Jonah knew that if they didn't get out of here soon, they were as good as dead. "We need to get back to the house," Caleb muttered between breaths. "We'll figure out what to do next there." His voice was steady, but the urgency was unmistakable. Caleb had always been the voice of reason in their partnership, but even he couldn't hide the desperation creeping into his tone. Jonah didn't answer right away. His mind was spinning, processing everything they had learned in those few frantic minutes at the warehouse. His father, Thomas. The syndicate, Ethan. His whole life had just shifted on its axis, and now he was left with more questions than answers. Why was his father involved? What had Ethan uncovered that had gotten him dragged into all of this? Was his brother still alive? Or had he been swallowed up by the same darkness that had already claimed so many others? His heart beat faster with each question, but he didn't dare to stop. Not now. Not when they were so close. They had come too far. They took another turn, and Jonah felt a wave of relief when they finally reached the safety of the side streets. The shadows swallowed them whole, and they moved quickly, making their way toward the one place that still felt like home, Jonah's house. It was the only place left that felt familiar, that didn't carry the weight of the syndicate's grip. As they slipped through the back gate, Jonah allowed himself a brief moment of respite. The danger wasn't over, but for now they were safe. Inside, the familiar smell of old wood and musty books greeted them. Jonah didn't take the time to turn on any lights. Instead, he moved toward the kitchen, pacing back and forth as he tried to process what they had just learned. Caleb dropped his backpack onto the chair and leaned against the counter, watching him closely. Jonah's hands clenched into fists at his sides, the frustration bubbling up inside him. His mind refused to settle. "I don't understand," Jonah muttered, his voice rising in pitch as he tried to make sense of it all. His eyes were wide, his pulse still racing from the escape. "Why would my father be involved with these people? What's his connection to all this?" He turned to face Caleb, his eyes searching for answers that neither of them had. Caleb, usually the first to offer a solution, remained silent for a long moment. Jonah noticed the way his friend's lips pressed together, the way his eyes darted toward the window as though expecting danger at any moment. Caleb took a slow breath, pushing off the counter to stand beside Jonah. "Maybe he didn't have a choice," Caleb said quietly, his voice softer now, thoughtful. Maybe he got caught up in something he couldn't get out of. You know how these things work. The deeper you go, the harder it is to come back. Caleb's tone was matter-of-fact, but Jonah could see the doubt flickering behind his eyes. Jonah shook his head violently, as if to shake off the thought. His father, the man who had raised him, who had always seemed so solid, so untouchable, couldn't have been part of this. But deep down, Jonah knew Caleb was right. His father had changed over the years. There were too many things Jonah had ignored, too many oddities that never quite added up. The wealth, the secrets, the way Thomas had always distanced himself from the family after Ethan disappeared. Jonah clenched his teeth, his frustration building. "I won't let them get away with this," Jonah muttered, his voice thick with emotion. His fists were tight, the anger rising in his chest like a tide. "Not after everything they've done to my family. I'll do whatever it takes to stop them." Caleb placed a hand on Jonah's shoulder, his expression grave. "I know you will," he said, his voice calm, steady. "But you're not alone in this, Jonah. We'll bring Ethan back. Together." Jonah's breath slowed as he met Caleb's eyes. The weight of their mission hung heavy in the room, but the words felt like a lifeline. They weren't alone. As long as they stuck together, they had a chance. The road ahead would be dangerous, and the enemies they faced would stop at nothing to keep their secrets buried. But Jonah wouldn't let that stop him. The night wore on, and Jonah sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the maps and documents they had gathered. The truth was out there. Ethan was out there. Jonah felt it in his bones. He couldn't give up. Not now. Not when he was so close. He looked at Caleb one last time before speaking, his voice firm and unwavering. "We'll find him," Jonah said, the resolve in his words absolute. "We will." Jonah sat on the edge of his bed, his fingers nervously drumming against his knees. The evening light outside had long since faded, leaving the room dim and heavy with the weight of unanswered questions. Caleb was across the room, pacing back and forth, the creak of the floorboards punctuating the silence. Jonah could feel the tight knot in his stomach, a cold, relentless anxiety gnawing at him. The walls of the room felt as if they were closing in, the air thick with the unspoken tension between them. "We're being watched," Jonah muttered, barely above a whisper. His voice was hoarse, as though the weight of the situation was pressing down on him from all sides. Every glance out the window, every shadow in the corner of his vision, made him feel like someone was always one step behind them. He couldn't shake the feeling that the syndicate had eyes everywhere, tracking their every move. Their presence seemed to hang over him like a storm cloud, waiting to burst. Caleb stopped pacing and turned to face him. His eyes were sharp, his expression tight with worry. "I know. I felt it too." He walked over to Jonah's desk and picked up one of the old maps of the town, tracing his fingers over the creases as if it might reveal something they missed. "But we can't stop now, Jonah. We're too close." Jonah nodded, but the doubt in his mind gnawed at him, even as his resolve hardened. Every step they took seemed to lead them deeper into a maze of deceit. The clues they'd uncovered, the whispers of corruption, had only brought them closer to the truth, but also to the heart of the danger. And yet, despite the threat looming over them, Jonah felt a flicker of something inside him, something darker and more desperate than before. The need to know. He had to confront his father, had to hear it from him, no matter the cost. The possibility that his own father might be involved in all of this twisted inside him like a knife. Caleb's voice cut through his thoughts. "What if your father is in too deep to help us?" He sat down, his voice lowering. "What if he's working with them?" Jonah's heart skipped a beat at the suggestion, the words ringing in his ears like a warning bell. He felt the blood drain from his face as the full weight of the question settled over him. The idea of his father, his hero, the man who had raised him, being part of something so insidious seemed impossible. Yet, as Caleb spoke, Jonah's mind flashed to the meetings he'd overheard, to the strange late nights when his father had come home with that distant, faraway look in his eyes. He thought of the sudden wealth, the unexplained wealth that seemed to appear out of nowhere. The pieces, once separate and disjointed, began to connect in a way that left him feeling sick. "I don't want to believe it," Jonah whispered, his voice barely audible. He clenched his fists in his lap, trying to force back the overwhelming wave of disbelief. He had spent his entire life admiring his father, trusting him with everything. The thought that Thomas might have been involved with the syndicate, the very thing they were trying to take down, felt like a betrayal too deep to comprehend. But the more he thought about it, the more the weight of it all began to sink in. He couldn't ignore the truth forever. If he was going to find Ethan, if he was going to end the syndicate's stranglehold on their town, he had to know for sure. "I have to know for sure," Jonah said, his voice gaining strength with each word. He stood up suddenly, the weight of his decision settling into his bones. "I can't keep wondering. I need to hear it from him." His jaw tightened, and his eyes met Caleb's, dark with determination. "I have to confront him." Caleb's face softened with concern, but he didn't hesitate. "Jonah, be careful. You're not just going up against your father. You're up against an entire network of people who will stop at nothing to protect themselves." His tone was low, but Jonah could hear the urgency in it. Caleb had always been the cautious one, the one who calculated every move before acting. And Jonah appreciated that more than he ever let on. But this time, Jonah couldn't be cautious. He couldn't wait any longer. "I'll do what I have to do," he said, his voice firm, cutting through the uncertainty in his chest. If that moment sent chills down your spine and your heart raced, don't stay silent. Subscribe and become a member, because finding answers requires courage and perseverance. Jonah stood outside the study door, his heart thundering in his chest. The house was quiet, the usual evening stillness stretching between him and his father, Thomas, who was seated in his familiar armchair, reading old newspapers. The warm glow from the desk lamp cast shadows along the walls, illuminating the tired lines on Thomas's face. The man Jonah had always looked up to seemed smaller somehow. His broad shoulders hunched as he scanned the paper, lost in thought. The weight of what Jonah was about to do pressed down on him like a heavy cloak. He'd never expected to find himself standing here like this, on the precipice of discovering the one thing he'd been avoiding for years. His father had always been his protector, his silent strength in a world that often felt chaotic. But now Jonah knew better. No longer could he look up to him in the same way. Not after everything he'd learned. Jonah inhaled sharply, steadying himself before knocking lightly on the door. He had to do this. There was no other choice. His father's gaze lifted from the paper, the wrinkles around his eyes deepening as he saw Jonah standing there. A flicker of surprise passed through his eyes, but it quickly gave way to something softer, something Jonah couldn't quite place. "Come in." Thomas's voice was low, almost resigned, as he set the newspaper aside. His hands trembled just slightly as he gestured for Jonah to enter. Jonah's throat tightened. He stepped into the room, the scent of aged paper and leather filling the air. The same room he'd spent countless hours in as a child, seeking his father's approval, listening to his quiet lectures, absorbing his wisdom. But tonight the air was different. It was thick with unspoken truths and the weight of years-long secrets. He could feel the room shrinking around him as his father's gaze never left his face. "What's on your mind, son?" Thomas's voice was calm, but there was an underlying strain to it, a sense that he already knew what was coming. Jonah's heart raced. This was it, the moment he had been both dreading and longing for. His hands clenched into fists at his sides, trying to steady the trembling that threatened to betray him. "I know what you've been involved in, Dad." Jonah's voice was steady, but it didn't feel like his own. It felt distant, like he was watching himself from the outside. "I know about the syndicate. I know about Ethan." The words hung between them like a weight, their finality filling the room. Thomas's face went ashen. He didn't flinch, didn't deny it. He simply stared at Jonah with a long, deep breath. His eyes, once filled with quiet strength, now reflected a turmoil Jonah had never seen before. For a long, suffocating moment, the only sound in the room was the slow tick of the old grandfather clock in the corner. Jonah took a step forward, his resolve solidifying. Why didn't you stop it, Dad? His voice cracked, but he pressed on, his anger and hurt spilling out. Why didn't you save him? Ethan, he was your son. You let them take him. Thomas's hands tightened on the armrests of his chair, his knuckles white. His voice came out in a hushed rasp, as if each word was a struggle. I tried, Jonah. Believe me, I tried. He shifted in his seat, but his gaze didn't waver. Once you're in their grasp, there's no getting out. They don't just let you walk away. Jonah's heart hammered in his chest, but he wasn't done. He needed the truth, the full, unfiltered truth. He had to know. I don't want excuses, Dad. I want to know where he is. Where's Ethan? The room felt colder now, the shadows in the corners of the study suddenly feeling more oppressive. Thomas lowered his gaze, his lips trembling, a deep sadness overtaking his features. He spoke so quietly that Jonah almost didn't hear him. I don't know where he is anymore, Jonah, but I know he's still alive. And I know the syndicate won't stop until they've destroyed him. Jonah's blood ran cold. The words hit him harder than any blow could. His father, the man who had been his anchor, had just admitted something Jonah couldn't fathom. Ethan wasn't just lost. He was still out there, somewhere in the clutches of the syndicate. So you just let them win? Jonah's voice was thick with emotion, a mix of anger and disbelief. You're just going to sit here and let it happen? Thomas's face twisted, the weight of years of guilt pressing down on him. His voice cracked as he answered. I never had a choice, Jonah. And now, neither do you. Jonah's mind spun, the gravity of his father's words settling into his chest like lead. He could barely process it. There was still so much more to uncover. His father's involvement, Ethan's disappearance, it was all part of a much larger, much darker game. But he couldn't let this be the end of it. He couldn't let his father's failure be the end of his brother's story. I'll find him, Dad, Jonah said, his voice stronger now, his resolve hardening with each passing second. I'll finish what Ethan started. Jonah's fingers trembled as he flipped through the pages of the old ledger, the dim light of the desk lamp casting shadows on his face. His eyes skimmed over rows of cryptic numbers, transaction codes, and dates that meant nothing to him at first. The air in the room was heavy, thick with the scent of old paper and the faint mustiness of forgotten secrets. Caleb sat beside him, his brow furrowed in concentration. The only sound in the room the occasional scratch of Jonah's pen as he made notes in his own book. Then, suddenly, Caleb's voice broke the silence, low and urgent. Jonah, look at this. His voice held a sharpness that made Jonah's pulse quicken. He leaned over, instinctively holding his breath as if the air itself might give away a secret. There, amidst the clutter of random financial transactions, was a name that stood out like a beacon in the dark, a name Jonah had never seen before. The architect. Jonah's eyes narrowed, tracing the strange words on the page. He was familiar with 100 other names from his brother's research, from the syndicate's twisted web of connections, but this one was new. Caleb leaned back in his chair, his face pale in the flickering light. The architect, he repeated, his tone laced with disbelief. I've heard that name before. He's the one who oversees everything, the one who makes the deals, calls the shots. If we find him, we'll have the answers we need. Jonah's breath caught in his chest. The architect. The name seemed to pulse with a dark promise. A single thread that could unravel the entire tapestry of corruption that had ensnared his family and his town. He felt the weight of the words press down on him, but there was no time for hesitation. Where do we find him? Jonah asked, his voice hoarse, desperate for an answer. His eyes never left the ledger, his mind already racing with possibilities. This could be the break he had been waiting for, the key that would unlock the door to the syndicate's secrets and, maybe, bring Ethan home. Caleb ran a hand through his hair, frustration tightening the lines of his jaw. I don't know, he said, his voice tinged with uncertainty. But I do know one thing, we can't do this alone anymore. We need someone on the inside, someone who knows the syndicate's operation. Jonah's heart sank as his mind drifted to a name he wished he could forget. The politician, Dorian Kane, the man who had been present in the photograph Jonah had found in the farmhouse. The man whose icy gaze haunted him every time he closed his eyes. Dorian Kane was at the heart of everything, the puppet master whose strings Jonah had seen only a glimpse of. Jonah stood up abruptly, his chair scraping harshly against the floor, sending a sharp echo through the room. His fists clenched at his sides, his thoughts aligning with a single truth. "We have to confront him," Jonah said, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside him. His eyes locked onto Caleb's, his gaze unwavering. "We'll get him to talk." Jonah's heart thudded in his chest as he and Caleb approached the towering gates of Dorian Kane's estate. The mansion loomed in the distance, perched atop the hill like an unassailable fortress, far removed from the poverty-stricken areas they'd grown up in. Its elegant facade, with towering columns and sweeping balconies, spoke of wealth and power that belonged to the Syndicate, the shadowy organization that had orchestrated so much suffering in their town. The gates were imposing, their black ironwork intricately twisted into menacing shapes. Jonah's steps slowed, the weight of what they were about to do sinking in. Every inch of this place exuded danger, and Jonah could feel it pressing down on him. There was no turning back now. The truth had to come out no matter the cost. "We're getting answers today," Jonah muttered under his breath, his voice low, determined. Caleb's hand, resting at his side, flexed as he too prepared for what was ahead. The air was thick with the scent of earth and the occasional trace of expensive cologne wafting from the direction of the estate. Jonah could hear his own pulse in his ears, a steady drumbeat of anticipation and fear. As they reached the front door, a tall security guard blocked their path, his eyes narrowing suspiciously. Jonah's stomach churned as the guard sized them up, but Caleb was ready. His voice was smooth, confident, as he stepped forward, offering the practiced smile of someone accustomed to deception. "We need to speak with Mr. Kane about a matter of public interest," Caleb said, his tone friendly yet firm. The guard didn't move immediately, his gaze shifting between them. The seconds stretched like minutes as Jonah felt every muscle in his body tense. Caleb didn't flinch, standing tall and calm, though Jonah could see the subtle tightening of his jaw. He wasn't quite as unshaken as he appeared. The silence stretched, but finally, the guard's shoulders dropped, and he stepped aside, motioning for them to enter. Jonah exhaled slowly, the tension leaving his body in a slow, deliberate release. But it was replaced by another kind of dread, the kind that made his skin crawl. They were now in the lion's den, and it was impossible to predict how this would end. The interior of the mansion was just as intimidating as its exterior, filled with rich, dark woods and grand chandeliers that hung like silent sentinels over the marble floors. Jonah's footsteps echoed as they followed the guard down long corridors, each one more lavish and ornate than the last. Paintings of stoic ancestors stared down at them, their expressions fixed and indifferent, as though they, too, were merely observers of whatever dark deeds had transpired within these walls. Jonah couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that every step they took was being tracked. He wasn't sure if it was his paranoia, or if it was the ever-growing tension of the moment, but the sensation gnawed at him. Caleb remained silent, but Jonah could feel the silent connection between them, the understanding that there was no turning back. They arrived at the study, a large, opulent room that smelled faintly of cigars and leather. There, sitting behind a massive oak desk, was Dorian Kane. His sharp eyes lifted from the papers he had been reading, locking onto Jonah and Caleb with a cold, calculating gaze. His lips curled into a smile, but there was no warmth in it, just a glint of amusement as he took them in. "What do you want?" His voice was sharp, slicing through the tension in the room. There was no surprise in his tone, no hesitation. He knew why they were here. Jonah's throat tightened, but he didn't flinch. He'd come too far to back down now. "We know what you're a part of," Jonah said, his voice unwavering. He could feel Caleb's presence beside him, steady and solid, but his own words felt heavy as they hung in the air. "We know about the Syndicate and we know about Ethan. You're going to tell us everything." Dorian's lips twitched upward, the corners of his mouth curling into a smirk that sent a cold shiver down Jonah's spine. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled in front of him. His gaze never left Jonah, as though he were sizing him up, deciding if Jonah was truly worth the effort. "You think you can intimidate me?" Dorian's voice was low, almost mocking. "You have no idea what you're dealing with. You've made a grave mistake coming here." Jonah's stomach tightened, but he forced himself to meet Dorian's gaze. His heart raced, a surge of adrenaline flooding his veins. But the truth was out there, and no amount of intimidation would stop him. "We're not leaving until you talk," Jonah said, his voice low but resolute. His jaw clenched, and he could feel Caleb's steady presence beside him, unwavering. Dorian leaned back even further in his chair, the smirk never leaving his face. He looked like a man who had everything under control, like he was in charge of the world around him. "Very well," Dorian said, his voice smooth and condescending. "But I'll warn you, once you know the truth, there's no going back." Jonah's heart hammered in his chest as Dorian Kane's words reverberated in his mind. The room, once thick with anticipation, now felt like a suffocating tomb. Dorian sat across from him, a predatory calm in his eyes, his lips curling into a cold, cruel smile. The confession had come too easily, as if he had been waiting for Jonah to ask the right questions. "Your brother was never supposed to get involved," Dorian said, his voice flat, devoid of any remorse. He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms over his chest. "He was a threat to us." Jonah felt the ground shift beneath him, as if the earth itself was trembling under the weight of Dorian's words. He had suspected it for years, the secret deals, the power that had slithered through Harrowsville. But hearing it spoken aloud, hearing it come from the mouth of the very man who had manipulated everything, was another thing entirely. "He got too close to the truth," Dorian continued, eyes narrowing as he studied Jonah, as if he were inspecting a bug caught in a web. "He learned things he shouldn't have." Jonah's blood boiled, his throat tightened, and he could barely breathe as the anger surged through him like a wave crashing against a cliff. He gripped the edge of the table in front of him, his knuckles turning white, his teeth ground together. "So you took him," Jonah said, his voice low and dangerous. "You silenced him." Dorian's lips twitched as if Jonah's accusation amused him. His posture was relaxed, unfazed by the venom in Jonah's words. "We didn't take him," he said, his voice like ice. "He made a choice, and when he decided to fight back, we had no choice but to deal with him." The finality of Dorian's words echoed through Jonah's mind, drowning out everything else. His breath came in ragged gasps as the room seemed to close in on him. Ethan, his brother, had made a choice that had led to this moment. His mind raced with all the possibilities, all the unanswered questions. What had Ethan discovered? How had he fought back? And what had happened to him once he had been silenced? Jonah felt his chest tighten, his heart pounding in his ears. The cold, sharp truth was now out in the open, and it felt like a knife twisting in his gut. But before he could speak, Caleb's voice broke through his rising fury. "Where is he, Dorian?" Caleb demanded, stepping forward, his voice steady but tinged with desperation. He had been quiet, watching Jonah absorb the gravity of Dorian's confession, but now his tone was sharp, purposeful. "Where's Ethan?" Dorian's smile widened. A dark, cruel thing. "You're too late," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Ethan is already gone. There's nothing you can do now." Jonah's heart sank into his stomach, the weight of Dorian's final words crashing over him like an avalanche. His legs wobbled beneath him, and he fought to keep his composure. The bitterness in Dorian's eyes was like a slap to the face, mocking Jonah's search, mocking everything he had fought for. Ethan was gone, gone forever, and all the pieces Jonah had so carefully put together, all the years of searching, had led to this point of no return. But then something inside Jonah snapped. He couldn't allow this to be the end. He couldn't let Dorian or the syndicate or anyone else take his brother's life and legacy without a fight. His body trembled with the need to act, to make this man, this monster, pay for what he had done. He straightened his back, his voice steady and cold as ice. "We'll bring it all down," Jonah said, his words firm, unwavering. "And we'll make sure you never hurt anyone again." Jonah stared at the stack of documents on the table, his fingers trembling as they hovered over the top page. The weight of it all was crushing. This was no longer just about his missing brother. This was a war against a machine, an entrenched corruption so vast it sprawled into every crevice of Harrowsville. He could feel the pulse of it, like a cold current running beneath the town's surface, suffocating the air and the lives it touched. Caleb sat across from him, his arms crossed tightly, eyes narrowing as he scanned the evidence. Every paper, every recorded conversation, every photo of Dorian Kane with the dark figures in the shadows, each one a piece of a puzzle that they'd only just begun to put together. "This is it, Jonah," Caleb said quietly, his voice calm but heavy with the weight of what they were about to do. He leaned forward, his fingers brushing a letter. "We take this to the people, to the authorities. We show them the truth. We expose them all." His jaw clenched, his usual easygoing demeanor gone, replaced with something sharper. Jonah could see it, the resolve, the same fiery determination that had burned in his eyes when they first set out to find Ethan. But now it was more than that. This wasn't just for Ethan anymore. This was for everyone who'd been silenced. Jonah nodded, but the gnawing doubt still gnawed at him. They had the leverage now, they had Dorian Kane's confession, the thing that would destroy the syndicate. But the road ahead felt like a jagged cliff. One false move, and everything could come crashing down. The syndicate was too entrenched. The people they would expose weren't just men in dark suits. They were powerful figures, pillars of the community. And they were not going down quietly. The harsh glow of the desk lamp flickered, casting long shadows on the walls of Jonah's room. The house was eerily quiet, the only sound the occasional creak of the old wooden floors beneath his feet. As he stood there, his mind replayed the events of the past few weeks, the endless hours of searching, the faces of those he thought he could trust, only to find them tangled in the web of lies and betrayal. But it was his father's face that haunted him the most. His father had been a man of few words, a man who kept secrets beneath the surface. But this darkness that had taken over their town, his family, it was something Jonah had never imagined. "What if we're too late?" Jonah muttered, his voice thick with frustration. "What if Ethan's gone forever, Caleb?" Caleb looked up from the papers, his gaze unwavering. "You can't think like that," he said firmly. "You know your brother. He wouldn't have gone down without a fight. And you've got the proof now. You've got the truth. You're not alone in this, Jonah. We're not alone." His words were steady, but there was something in his eyes, something that said he too was uncertain, yet determined to stand by his side, no matter the cost. Jonah let out a long breath, running a hand through his hair. The night air felt thick as he opened the window, the faint sound of crickets buzzing outside. "I know," he whispered, though part of him still doubted. "But what if this is bigger than we think? What if exposing them just makes things worse?" Caleb leaned forward, his eyes intense. "You can't let them win, Jonah. You know what they've done. You know what they're capable of. This isn't just about Ethan anymore. It's about everyone they've hurt. About the whole damn town. You've seen it. You've felt it. They've been controlling everything, manipulating everyone. But it stops now. You've got everything you need. You can expose them, tear it all down." Jonah's eyes flickered with uncertainty. "But what if it's not enough? What if they're too powerful?" "They're not invincible," Caleb replied, his voice firm. "And if we're going down swinging. We're doing this for Ethan, for your brother, for everyone they've hurt." Jonah closed his eyes, the weight of their mission pressing down on him. He had never felt so torn, so helpless, and yet so determined. His brother had disappeared all those years ago, but Jonah had never stopped looking. He had fought against the dark silence of his town, against the growing suspicion that something far more sinister was at play. And now, with every step they took toward exposing the syndicate, the truth was unraveling in front of him. "I'm doing this for Ethan," Jonah said softly, his voice filled with quiet strength. "And I won't stop until I bring him back. I won't let them destroy this town, destroy everything Ethan fought for. We have to do this, Caleb. We can't let them win. We can't let this darkness keep controlling our lives." He turned to Caleb, his eyes burning with conviction. "I'm ready to face it all." Caleb stood up, nodding in agreement. "And I'm with you, every step of the way." Jonah felt his resolve solidify, his doubts pushed aside by the fire of purpose. They were about to step into the heart of the storm. But as long as they had the truth, they had a chance to change everything. The walls of Harrowsville had stood for too long, built on corruption and lies, and Jonah was done standing by while it continued. The time for fighting back had come. As he stood there in the quiet of his room, the weight of the task ahead of him was undeniable. But in that moment, Jonah knew one thing for certain. He couldn't turn back now. "We're bringing everything into the light," he whispered to himself. "And we'll bring Ethan back with us." The room was suffocating, heavy with a tension that felt like it could crush the walls at any moment. Jonah stood at the front of the town hall, clutching a stack of papers and a video recording. His fingers trembled, but his grip was tight, holding on to the evidence that would change everything. The mayor sat at the head of the room, his face a mask of indifference, but Jonah could see the flicker of fear in his eyes. The mayor knew what was coming. They all did. Jonah had been preparing for this moment for years, the weight of it pressing down on him like an anvil. The memories of his brother, Ethan, came rushing back. Ethan's voice, his laugh, his determination to uncover the truth, even if it meant risking everything. It was that same determination that fueled Jonah now. His father, Thomas, had been silenced by the syndicate, trapped in a web of lies that stretched far beyond their family. Jonah was done hiding. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for Ethan's legacy, for the truth that had been buried for so long. With every document Jonah laid out on the table, the room grew quieter. The murmurs of the townspeople faded as the truth seeped into the air like a toxic gas. The leaders of Harrowsville, the very men who had controlled the town for years, were finally being exposed for their corruption. Dorian Kane's name had been the first to surface, but it was just the beginning. Jonah could see the faces in the room change as the weight of the evidence settled in. They were realizing that they had been part of something far darker than they had ever imagined. "This is just the beginning," Jonah's voice rang out, steady despite the storm of emotions surging within him. His eyes locked with the mayor's, and he could see the man's resolve starting to crack. "This town is not your playground anymore. The people deserve justice, and we're going to get it." But before anyone could respond, the lights above them flickered, casting the room in an eerie half-light. A low murmur of confusion rippled through the crowd, followed by the sound of footsteps, heavy, deliberate. The doors to the room slammed open, and a group of men stormed in, their faces masked with cold determination. Syndicate enforcers. Jonah's heart skipped a beat as his mind raced. They had come for him, for all of them. His breath caught in his throat, but he refused to back down. He couldn't afford to. This was it. Everything they had worked for, everything they had risked, had led them to this moment. He had to stand his ground. Caleb was already moving, stepping forward with a calm authority that contrasted sharply with the chaos unfolding around them. His posture was solid, his jaw set in a hard line as he faced the enforcers. Jonah felt a surge of gratitude, knowing that Caleb was there, ready to back him up. "You can't stop this. It's already over." Caleb's voice was quiet but filled with strength. The enforcers hesitated, exchanging uncertain glances. Jonah's pulse hammered in his ears, but he knew they couldn't back down now. The room had already shifted, the power balance changing with every word they spoke. He felt a sudden surge of confidence, the kind that comes when you know you're right, when you know you've already won, no matter what the opposition throws at you. "We're not afraid of you," Jonah said, his voice low but unwavering. "Not anymore." The enforcers looked at each other, their expressions tight with frustration. But before they could make a move, the chaos erupted. The room became a blur of bodies, fists, and the sound of chairs scraping against the floor. Jonah's heart raced as he fought back, his fists connecting with the nearest enforcer, his body moving on instinct. He was aware of Caleb beside him, the two of them working together in perfect synchronization, pushing forward against the tide of violence. It was not just a fight of fists, it was a fight for control, for power, for the very soul of Harrowsville. Jonah fought with everything he had, remembering Ethan's words, remembering the sacrifice that had been made. This wasn't just about revenge. This was about breaking the chains that had bound their town for so long. They couldn't let it end here. When the dust finally settled, the room was eerily silent. Jonah stood panting, bloodied and bruised, but unbroken. His eyes swept over the room, now filled with the wreckage of the syndicate's enforcers and the stunned expressions of Harrowsville's leaders. The truth had come crashing down, and there was no going back. The syndicate had been exposed, their grip on the town finally broken. Jonah's voice was steady, but it carried the weight of everything they had just fought for. "This is our town now," he said, his gaze sweeping across the room, "and we'll never let them take it from us again." The victory was bittersweet. Ethan was still gone. The fight had cost them so much, and the future of Harrowsville would never be the same. But Jonah knew one thing: Ethan's legacy wasn't just in his disappearance. It was in every person who had stood up, every person who had refused to be silenced. Harrowsville had changed, and it had already begun. "We'll keep fighting, Ethan," Jonah whispered to the empty room, his voice filled with quiet strength. "And we'll make sure your sacrifice was worth it. The past is finally uncovered, and the truth is out. If you stand for justice, hope, and truth, hit subscribe and join the channel. Together we rise." Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores themes of family, the search for truth, and the consequences of decisions made in moments of fear and desperation. Its purpose is to raise awareness, provoke thought, and inspire empathy and action toward healing and understanding.